connect climate change and healthcare.
It's always been about protecting people.
As good stewards of the environment and also solving their water shortage issues.
Green energy is one path that's well worth taking.
I learned early on that you pay close attention to what the nurses have to say.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast 3 of Truth, Courage, and Solutions. I'm your host, Riley Pennington. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be discussing waterway pollution of excess nitrogen and phosphorus and different ways to combat this issue. We will be joined by experts Autumn Fisher and George Blair. Autumn is a certified Advanced Wastewater Operator in the state of Wisconsin with 14 years of experience operating and optimizing water treatment processes and technologies. She has her undergraduate degree in chemistry and a master's in project management. As vice president of project delivery with ClearAs, she brings her technical water background together with her project management skills to marshal ClearAs projects around the country. You will also hear George Blair, a city council member for New Albin, a small town of less than 500 located along the Mississippi River in the northeastern corner of Iowa. George played a pivotal role in gaining DNR approval, ensuring funding, and now overseeing construction of a new innovative water treatment plant. One of the ways to remove excess nitrogen and phosphorus from our water is through the use of algae. Algae-based water treatment plants use a plant-based approach to recover valuable nutrients from municipal and industrial wastewater to deliver water quality that meets or exceeds current and future regulations. They also produce byproducts from algae growth that can be cycled back to the earth as fertilizer. This cycle is known as circular economy, a sustainable alternative to the traditional linear take, make, dispose economic model, reducing waste to a minimum by reusing, repairing, refurbishing, and recycling existing materials and products. Autumn Fisher explains what the ClearAs system is and how it is being used to effectively and efficiently process wastewater.
ClearAs is the wastewater treatment company, and what we do is we have a technology that is essentially a bolt-on feature to wastewater treatment plants. But what sets us apart from other options is that we are a biological solution that uses algae for nutrient removal and recovery from wastewater. A lot of our competitors out on the market are using mechanical solutions, so filtration processes, settling, and other mechanical functions for treatment, and we're using biology. We're just doing what algae does naturally, and that is assimilates nutrients through photosynthesis.
And so what impurities does this system work for?
So the primary constituents that the ClearAs system, the eco-recover technology removes are phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon. So we actually sequester carbon as part of our process because CO2 is required for photosynthesis. But as a function of our process flow, we not only take out nutrients like phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon, we also remove total suspended solids, reduce biochemical oxygen demand or BOD. We will reduce the pathogens in the water, so fecal coliform and E. coli. And then we will see some reduction in metals across the process as well, just because of adsorption of metals to the algae surface. So there's a variety of different constituents, but the primary targets really are phosphorus, nitrogen, and carbon sequestration.
Could you explain, so it's kind of obvious with the fecal and the solids that we don't want that in our effluent water, but could you explain why the nitrates and the phosphorus is so important to remove?
Yeah, absolutely. So water that's discharged from wastewater treatment plants, if it is rich in phosphorus and nitrogen still, what happens is those nutrients enter the receiving bodies. So it's the local lakes, the local rivers, the streams. And what happens when phosphorus and nitrogen enter the water in excess is that you can actually generate conditions for algae blooms. So the algae will grow in the water bodies, and those algae blooms can sometimes lead to toxic algae blooms and the growth of cyanobacteria. So you have these beautiful waterways, and especially, here in Wisconsin where I live, with so many wonderful lakes and recreational resources, the last thing that you want is a beautiful lake that's overgrown with algae. So by taking the phosphorus and the nitrogen out of the water before you discharge it, you actually reduce the likelihood of having those algae blooms occur in the water.
Another question about the system itself. Are there any risks for using the algae method, or could this be harmful in any way?
No, so that's one of the key benefits. So we're taking the problem, the algae bloom that can occur in the lake or the river, and we've turned it into the solution. So we're using the algae to take out the nutrients, but we're doing it in a controlled environment. And one of the key benefits of our process, actually, that I didn't touch on yet, is that the algae that is growing naturally within our process in that controlled environment, we're feeding it phosphorus and nitrogen and carbon dioxide. We actually harvest that algae out of the process because algae actually grows very quickly. It replicates every 24 to 48 hours. So we have to continuously harvest or take some of that algae out. And then what we do with that algae is we actually partner with a variety of different buyers and off-takers, and we sell that algae to them because they're turning it into sustainable products. So bio-based plastics, foams, inks, and other things like that. So there's actually value from that algae that is generated by just treating the wastewater. And these wastewater plants, they have to treat the water. They have to meet discharge requirements. So not only do they meet their discharge requirements, but they also have the benefit of the value of that algae that we buy back from them.
What challenges do you face with implementation and operation of the system? And I guess what I want to ask in addition to that is, who is making these decisions as to what your requirements are for your effluent water, and who monitors that?
Yeah, so the regulation is driven by the state. So it's either the state Department of Natural Resources or, equivalent regulatory agency, or even at the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency level. So it's those agencies that set the levels or the discharge requirements for the wastewater treatment plants. So where we find our technology most applicable is in the states and the areas that are regulated and have to meet low discharge requirements for phosphorus and nitrogen. So it's really interesting that depending on the region that you're in, you can really have a wide variety of discharge requirements. So some states, such as Wisconsin, have very stringent phosphorus discharge requirements, and there's a lot of applications or potential opportunities to integrate our technology. But just nearby in Illinois, for example, a neighboring state, they actually don't have any phosphorus discharge requirements. They have some that are starting to come down the pipeline, but not currently. So there's a variety of different applications. It's typically regional, but one of the key opportunities that we're seeing more recently is we can actually partner industries. So food manufacturers, car manufacturers, a variety of, cheese, dairy manufacturers, because what all of these companies are trying to do right now is they're trying to reduce their carbon footprint to become more sustainable. And one of the key benefits is that we sequester carbon. The algae needs CO2 to go through photosynthesis. It converts that CO2 to oxygen through respiration, and it uses that carbon to convert to carbohydrates for energy for the algae for growth. So if we can create these partnerships between industries that need to reduce their carbon footprint, and they have a source of carbon available because they're emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, with a local wastewater treatment plant, and build a clear system there and utilize the CO2 from the industry, there's a mutual benefit, right? By reducing the carbon footprint of the industry and then also meeting discharge requirement or higher quality discharge from the wastewater plants.
So I saw on your website, or on the Clearis website, that there's a lot of plants in Wisconsin, but then Montana, where this company started, and then other places around the country as well. Do you see that this type of technology is maybe more available or offered to maybe higher income places, or I guess, do you see any disparities in where this could be offered and where it isn't?
No, we really don't see any limitations. I think, again, the biggest driver comes back to, what the discharge requirements are, hence the reason that you see so much activity in Wisconsin. But we have other opportunities where, again, creating those partnerships between industries and wastewater plants, or maybe aging infrastructure. So the example of the Utah facility, they have severely outdated and aging infrastructure. And one way for them to avoid doing a very large and expensive plant upgrade was actually to incorporate our technology. So there's really a variety of different drivers. It isn't reserved to, higher economic classifications or, more income availability. It really is just the needs of the wastewater plant or the local industry that drive progress.
So is the system run differently in different areas? So for example, areas that have maybe more farmland versus more, I guess, areas where there's a lot of factories?
No, the operation remains the same. I think the application might change a little bit, just depending on what the characteristics of the water are. So you can have more rural areas that don't have as much industry or contributors to their wastewater treatment process. So it just changes potentially the design and the footprint of the system, but not the way it actually operates on a daily basis.
So how would natural disasters, I know in the front page of every news is all of the hurricane stuff that's happening in Florida. How would something like that affect a system like this?
So the greenhouses, that's probably the most vulnerable piece of the process, or it's perceived to be the most vulnerable piece. But the greenhouses are rated for up to 125 miles per hour wind excursions. So I think that is, I guess I don't know the wind ratings for different hurricanes or tornadoes, for example, but they're rated higher than I think what would be perceived. And frankly, when you have those natural disasters, you have a hurricane or a tornado, it doesn't matter what the infrastructure is in place, you're going to have detrimental effects regardless. So I recall seeing, story after story of, wastewater treatment plants that were impacted by the most recent hurricane down in Fort Myers area. And, they went days and days without service or operation, and water levels were 5 or 6 feet above sea level, and just drowning their wastewater treatment plants, for example. So I don't know that our technology is more susceptible to those events, because when those events happen, it really doesn't matter what technology or what equipment you have in place, everything is going to be impacted or affected negatively.
Sure. So this maybe wouldn't be affected any differently. It would still kind of have the same effects from any sort of flooding.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to ask about this as well. So we live obviously in Wisconsin, where winters can be pretty brutal. How would that, or how could that affect the implementation of this system?
Yeah, so we get this question a lot just because winters in Wisconsin are so brutal. But the water in our process. So from the time the water enters our system, the water in the algae mixture, from to the time it leaves the process, it only takes about, depending on the size and concentration that we're trying to treat, it only takes about 60 minutes to 120 minutes, so 1 to 2 hours. So the water is moving through the tanks and pipes so quickly that the temperature does not really impact or affect the process or the efficiency of the process. So we use the greenhouse for protection, for overhead protection from snow. It is heated, but it's really just for operator or, worker maintenance comfort than anything, because the water is in those pipes for such a short amount of time that you really aren't doing anything to heat the water up or cool the water down in that time period. You would just want to avoid any stagnant or standing still water, because then you would, have the potential for detrimental, freezing or things like that. But it's a continuous flow process. The water is constantly moving through the system. So really the weather does not impact us negatively at all.
So we talked a little bit about the sustainability and how Clear as relates to climate change. Can you touch a little bit more on maybe things that your company does to help different communities increase their sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest things that we're seeing in initiatives right now for sustainability is related to what's being referred to as the circular economy. So really eliminating waste in our world, in our environment. And one of the key benefits of our process is that it is truly a circular process. We're bringing in, wastewater that's high in nutrients. We can capture and recover, sequester CO2 from the environment. And as a result of that process, we have reuse quality water. So the water actually meets California Title 22 reuse standards because we have ultrafiltration in our process. We have a sustainable biomass, a plant-based product that we can sell for sustainable materials. And then we have, the carbon sequestration piece. So there really is no waste in our process, and that's why it's considered circular. So when we start to talk with, local municipalities, wastewater treatment plants, trying to partner them with industries that need to reduce their carbon footprint, it really does check the box on so many of the sustainability goals that these companies and these cities are making for themselves to, help our environment, reduce their emissions, and become, better stewards of the environment and more green and more friendly that way.
ClearAs, the company that Autumn Fisher works for, has algae water treatment plants across the United States. Autumn stated how they are able to make plastics, foams, and inks from algae waste. The ClearAs website lists even more innovative and sustainable products they create, such as running shoes, cosmetics, sporting goods, and even aviation fuel. On a smaller, more municipal scale is the water treatment plant in New Albin, Iowa. New Albin is a small town in northeast Iowa with a population of about 430 people, many of them retirees. When New Albin's traditional lagoon-based water treatment plant reached end of life, community member George Blair convinced the city to invest in a $5 million green alternative. Here, George describes his town and the algae wheel system the New Albin plant will use to remove excess nutrients and clarify its wastewater before it enters the Mississippi River. George also describes the financial incentive of this new plant in terms of preventing fines from the DNR.
When you go from Minnesota on the west side of the Mississippi, the first town you'll hit in Iowa is New Albin. And its population, it's a little village, really. We call it a town because we have water, we got obviously sewer plant, we have fire department, volunteer, we've got a police department. It's a little city of 432 people, not very big. Politically, it's conservative. I'm on the other side, but most people in town treat me with a lot of respect, so that's nice. So that gives you some idea what New Albin's like.
Yeah, and one of our classmates mentioned that there's a new water treatment plant. Can you tell me about the plant? What brought you or the town to decisions about making that plant as opposed to a decade ago or pushing down the road another 10 years or so? So why now?
Okay, well, I could tell you why. The plant that's now on the site was built in 1969. And the thing that's holding it together is duct tape and barbed wire. And I heard about the algae wheel that was being engineered by a company called One Water. I called them up and said, we'd like to see what you have. We went down and looked at a plant that they had put up in a state park. And it looked to me like it was functioning quite well, and I could see it was a new system. It had a greenhouse over it. and it did not smell. There was no odor to it. And I liked the looks of it, so we pursued it further and started examining the possibilities of this one water. The idea of this algae wheel, think of it as a big tank that's filled with these, they're not actually wheels, but they're like a cylinder with paddles on it that float around a rod. And the thing that causes them to turn is a bubbler system from underneath. It's got these pumps that send up bubbles. The bubbles hit the paddles. They turn these wheels slowly. And as algae begins to form on, they convert nitrites to nitrates. And it begins to break down the toxic chemicals that are in the waste. And the thing that I liked about it was that it had very little friction involved. And it's usually friction that wears any mechanism out. And with this system, without the friction, it looked to me like it would last for a long time. Then it was a case of trying to convince Department of Natural Resources to go with the new system. And that took a lot of convincing. And there's always reluctance in any government organization to take on a new system. We're finally at the point where we're now building the plant.
I just think that's amazing. Such a small town, and you're able to get something so innovative within a community that has 400 people. That's kind of mind-blowing. I mean, when you were researching this and you were talking to different people in areas within the field, did you come across, did you have to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of the new plant? Can you tell me about some advantages of this new plant compared to the old one? I know you mentioned that you were having a lot of trouble with friction and it was just wearing down, but are there specific advantages besides that for the new plant, from an environmental perspective and just the town's perspective?
Well, yeah, I mean, just the idea that it's one of the primary components of the system is algae. It's a plant, and it grows on these wheels, and the wheels turn, and it converts, as I said, it converts the toxic nitrites to nitrates. And then there's other things that go on, but basically that's it. I mean, you're trying to eliminate pH, the high pH, which is a problem for a lot of small towns and sewer plants. They're being fined, particularly in the cases like ours where the water's flowing into the Mississippi, the major river running through the United States. And you have to meet criteria established by the DNR that requires that the sewage you have flowing into the Mississippi is clean. That's not easy. The fact that this system, it appealed to me on a couple of basis. Not only the idea that there's very little friction, but there's a greenhouse. So you're using sunlight and you're using a plant that forms on these wheels. The sun shines on the algae turns in the tanks, and you get this conversion that goes on. That appealed to me. I hadn't seen anything like that. I asked the chief engineer there, I said, how'd you come up with this idea? And he said he was interested in feeding fish for fish farms. And before he worked for One Water, he developed this system that would clean the water in fish farm ponds. And so that's
interesting.
It went from that idea to a sewer plant. Right. There's another factor I want to throw in. It's my plan, and the city's going along with it, that I'd like to have the blowers and the pumps that run the system be run off of the DC solar panels. So we're going to set up solar arrays to supplement the power usage for this sewer plant. So that's the plan. We have to do something about global warming. Green energy is one path that's well worth taking, I think.
I'm wondering what you would tell other towns making infrastructure decisions like New Albans. How would you advise them to approach gaining momentum for such a radical change as what you guys are undergoing right now, and how would you advise they approach funding for something like this?
Well, it's been a long process. I would think that any town, I mean, I'm sure there's recognition of this, but I didn't realize how much time and effort would go into this. You have to be prepared for a mountain of paperwork and hours of discussion and meetings. And in this case, we're trying something new. It takes a lot to convince the DNR to go ahead. They want to eliminate risk, and rightfully so. But I think anybody that starts into this has to go in with their eyes open, that you've got to be prepared for a lot of work, and you need to do some homework. You need to look at these systems, where they are they working, is it a viable system? Take a trip and actually look to see what's there. Recently, I made a phone call because I was curious about other towns that had used the one water algae wheel. And I just did some research on the internet. And I found out this town, Naples, New York, up by the Finger Lakes, south of Rochester, New York, they hired One Water. And I was curious to see how that went. So I talked to the mayor, and he said, actually, they've had the plant operating for 2 years now, and they're very happy with it. In fact, they liked it so much that they were planning to expand a 1/3 grader to their current use and use One Water. So that was quite an endorsement, and I felt good about that. So about funding, to answer your question about funding, the first thing I looked at was finding grants to see whether there were grants available to help the town, especially small town, because we don't have many citizens and we don't want to bankrupt the town. And it's quite an expensive process to do this. There was a possibility for getting a $1 million loan forgiveness for that loan, and we got it, by the way. So it went from $4.5 million down to $3.5 million.
Oh, wow.
And plus the $300,000 grant minus the fees for administering that grant. So we got $275,000 plus $1 million in loan reduction. And it was all because I made the effort to get to know the people that are in charge of the purse strings. So I don't know if that's possible for everybody, but it worked in this case.
But good to know that there are options out there, right? I mean, you don't have to fund it completely on your own.
Oh, there's no way. We couldn't fund it. I mean, it was a loan that we got, and we figured out we're not going to bankrupt the town. We could actually pay for it.
It is amazing to hear how local initiatives, such as using algae, are helping to heal the damage we have imposed on the planet, and how even the smallest of cities can act innovatively to protect waterways as mighty as the Mississippi. On the last podcast of Truth, Courage, and Solutions, we will be describing even more ways to help prevent planetary harm. We will also be discussing how Indigenous people have been living harmoniously with the land and how we can use their knowledge and philosophies to implement these changes into our everyday lives. If you are hearing this message, you've listened to the entire episode, and for that, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We also want to extend our gratitude to our guest speakers who contributed so much to our understanding of climate-related health issues. The music you hear is Wanderlust by Scott Buckley, found on SoundCloud, promoted by Freestock Music Attribution 4.0 International CC by 4.0. A special thanks to Ayana Elizabeth Johnson and Katherine K. Wilkinson for their inspiration and guidance through their 2021 book, All We Can Save. From them came the framework for this podcast series, Truth, Courage, and Solutions. Turbo University also gratefully acknowledges that it stands on lands and amidst waters stewarded by the Sioux, Sauk, Fox, and Ho-Chunk peoples. This has been an academic project of the Turbo University's Direct Entry Masters of Nursing Science students, 2022 through 2023 school year. We hope you enjoyed this new episode, and if you did, please tune in for next.